Good morning, everybody. This is Pastor John with another edition of Monday Morning Quarterback. So yesterday we began our Lenten sermon series, Running from God, Life Lessons, from the book of Jonah. And the book of Jonah is one of my favorite books of the Bible. I like it because it is, first of all, it's a book that most of us could probably identify with if we really got into the story. Jonah's attitudes really reflect a lot of our own, but I also like it because it's a different take on dealing with issues. The book of Jonah is satirical, and it satirizes provincial attitudes that make God appear more of a tribal God rather than universal cosmic God that we worship today. And it challenges our notions about who's in control of our relationship with God. Jonah tries tirelessly to get God to bend to Jonah's will, and God simply refuses. And so it's sort of comical to watch that unfold. And it's comical because we're laughing with Jonah, not at him, because we can identify with a lot of the things that Jonah experiences. So in the first sermon, we talked about the fact that wherever you go, there God is. There really is no running away from God. However, again, what's comical about the story is God calls Jonah to go east to Nineveh to preach to the Ninevites. Jonah doesn't want to because he doesn't like the Ninevites. He doesn't want God to save the Ninevites. And so he gets on a boat going west to Tarshish. Now, in Jonah's day, Tarshish was the western edge of the known world. So he's literally trying to go as far away from Nineveh as he possibly can. He thinks that if he could just put separation between him and the place where God calls him to be, then everything will be all right. And I'm chuckling as I say that because we do stuff like that all the time. We, know that God calls us to do one thing and we just do the opposite thing in defiance, in fear, in whatever, but we do it all the time, and we make decisions that are not good for ourselves or really for anybody else because we're afraid to do what God calls us to do. And that speaks to really a dynamic in our relationship with God. I try, emphasis on the word try, in my spiritual practice to make my life one of daily surrender to God and each day, surrendering more and more of myself to God. I have varying degrees of success with that, as many of us do. Oftentimes my ego does get in the way. But it's important that we recognize the dynamic, because we, especially we in America, do not like to think of ourselves as surrendering or submitting to any authority, even the authority of God. But that's what God calls us to do, to submit, to surrender, because God knows the path to not just our personal salvation, but the salvation of the world. And as I look around, I'm always trying to find, help in my journey of surrender, of submission to God. And one of the things that I have talked about frequently, maybe here in Monday Morning Quarterback, but certainly from the pulpit on Sunday mornings, I've talked about the 12-step programs as a path to God. Whether you're an alcoholic or an addict of any kind, the 12 steps offer a spiritual program that is deeply meaningful. And in this situation, there's one of the lesser known 12-step groups is called Codependence Anonymous, or CODA for short. And it's basically for people who really want to learn how to live in healthy relationships with one another. And I would include God in that equation, learning to live in healthy relationship with God. And the 12 steps of Codependence Anonymous, are the same as AA or NA or any of the other A's, except for what they're powerless over. And so the first step is we admitted that we were powerless over others, that our lives had become unmanageable. And, I would add to that, we are powerless over others, and we are also powerless over God. And so maybe it's time we stop trying to invoke a power over God that does not exist. And the next two steps give us this wonderful starting point to do that. We came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. And the Christian tradition, obviously, we don't say a power greater than ourselves. We say God as we know him through his son, Jesus Christ. And the third step is made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understand God. And then it goes on to, give other steps as to how we can enact those principles. But those first three principles really illustrate, I think, what a life in God is supposed to look like. It is, whether we like it or not, one of submission, one of obedience. And the divine paradox of that is, by submitting to God, by obeying God, we experience true freedom. That's kind of cool. So as we consider the story of Jonah and how he tried to run as far from God as he could, let's be mindful of those times in our lives where we try to, kind of go our own way, and consider how those things usually end up. And maybe it's time for us to admit that we are powerless over others and we are powerless over God, and that our lives are sometimes unmanageable. But God can restore us to sanity. God can give us hope. God can set us free. Have a wonderful week, my friends. God bless.